My first guest tonight vowed to closely scrutinize Governor Cuomo's first budget when he took the oath of office for his first full term. Comptroller Tom DiNapoli is joining us from New York City tonight to offer his initial impressions of this spending plan. Comptroller, thanks so much for your time.
Always good to be with you, Liz.
And it's great to see you. So here's the thing. Yesterday, when we caught up with you, you said, it sounds great, you know, initially, but I haven't seen the details because it's quite a big document. Have you had more time to digest what Andrew Cuomo has proposed, and what do you think of it?
Yeah, well, we're going through that process. Staff's going through the process, actually, as we speak. We had a preliminary briefing right before the speech, and then obviously I was there for the presentation. Now we've been looking over the document. We will, within the next 10 days or so, have a detailed analysis of the budget proposal. At first glance, I think the governor's on the right track. I've been saying for a number of years now, we have to do a better job of controlling spending in the state, that our level of spending is unsustainable in the out years, and we continue to see it as a problem. And the governor used the same word, that New York has had spending that's not sustainable. So I think in broad stroke, he's certainly on the right track. Obviously, there are parts of the budget proposal where there's still a lot more detail to be determined. So we're going to analyze the information that's presented, but you take a big expense area like the Medicaid program, we're all going to have to wait and see what happens with that Medicaid task force before we really see what the impact will be in terms of reimbursement rates and how that will affect providers. So there'll be some questions for a while, I think. Right.
I mean, and not just with Medicaid, but also with the Mandate Relief Task Force, and also with the Prison Closing Task Force, and also with the negotiations with state workers. I mean, there are big chunks of this budget that sort of are up in the air and will be for at least a month or even maybe longer. I wanted to ask you...
and we hope that as much of that can be determined prior to April 1st. I don't know that all of it will be, so that people can really analyze what the impact is. But I think, we have to give the governor credit. You take an issue like Medicaid, which is a very tough issue to deal with. He put together a task force made up of key stakeholders, people who know the program, and if they can come up with a consensus, obviously that's going to be something that could be implemented probably more successfully than some of the other efforts at reforming Medicaid that we've seen in the past have been. So, let's see if this strategy works.
Right. You bring up an interesting issue, though, about time. I mean, when the task forces are reporting back on March 1st and the budget is due on April 1st, that doesn't give a lot of time to deal with something as complicated as Medicaid, really, to try and get that into budget language and to pass it past the legislature, particularly when there are so many interests competing, right?
Yeah, well, it's true, but again, we'll stick with the Medicaid example because it's one we're talking about. You've got representatives of the providers, of the hospitals, of the unions involved, and advocates. If they come up with a consensus approach, I don't know that there'll be a great disagreement. Obviously, if they fail to come up with a conclusion, or if they're deeply divided, and it's a split vote, then I think you're absolutely right. You'll see a contentious debate within the legislature as well. So the sooner that we get more information, the more time the legislature has to do their job, because they're elected to represent their districts, and they need to be a part of the process. It is important, though, and I want to echo the governor's call, that we get this budget done on time. We can't have the kind of broken budget process that we've seen too often in our state. Timeliness is important, as well as the quality of the document that's produced. Yeah,
the process actually is something that Andrew Cuomo has really taken aim at, not just the budget itself, but also this sort of inherent, he's been quite strong in his wording of it, but this inherent built-in growth from year to year that's built into the law, and then on top of that there were increases. He likened this to Enron, which I think that some of the elected officials, Dean Skelos, for example, took particular umbrage to. You're a former elected official, you're a former assemblyman. What was your response?
I'm a current elected official.
I'm sorry, a former legislative elected official. Forgive me, of course you are, a statewide elected official now. But what was as a former assemblyman, your response to that, because you were there a long time?
Look, in politics, people use different words and sometimes strong words to make a point. If you look at the budget reports that I put out since I've been controller, we always commented on the structural deficit that New York has built into its budget process and the out-year gaps. And when we've defined that structural deficit, we always have pointed out it's based on current law and current formulas that if they remain on the books, this is what the expense would be. And when people have asked me over the years, well, we have these big numbers, how can we possibly deal with it? I've always pointed out, well, part of that is the growth that's built into current law. So, I think for those that have worked on budgets, there's been a recognition that over a number of years now, where we've had a tough economy and the revenue's not coming in, we withstood or put aside many of the formulas and many of the languages that's in the permanent law. You take an item like revenue sharing for our localities. There's a much more generous formula that's been on the books, but for years now, that formula has been put aside because we haven't had the money to fund it.
Right.
So I do think the main point I think that the governor is saying that I think is on target. If we're putting aside these formulas on a regular basis anyway, then maybe it's time to say, why have them as part of the permanent law? Because they're not real. So put them aside so we have a more realistic and more simple way, a more transparent way for lawmakers, for citizens to understand, the real numbers of what we're dealing with. So I think if we have more transparency and simplicity in our budgeting, that would help everybody understand. The reality still is there are cuts in this budget. This is a tough budget. There's a lot of impacts to still be evaluated, and we are at a time where, because of this tough economy and because of spending commitments that we can't sustain, we're going to have to make some tough choices in New York, and now is the time to do that. Okay,
you actually, as a statewide elected official, as the Comptroller of New York, have a role to play. Of course, you certify that the budget is balanced once it's passed, but there's also some things in here that impact the Comptroller's office, that impact you. One of them has to do with the dormancy period for unclaimed funds. And if you would explain that to me, because I'm a little confused about how that works.
Yeah, it's one of the more obscure areas. And just, Liz, if I could just quickly qualify, I don't certify as to budget balance. We have to verify that the legislature has acted on the governor's bills, but we don't certify to budget balance. With regard to the dormancy issue, that relates to the abandoned property part of our responsibilities. As many people know, we've been putting out a lot of information about unclaimed funds. This very often, the simplest example could be an old savings account that someone had, and perhaps you've moved, and the bank lost track of your current address. After a certain period of time, under law, if that account is dormant or inactive, it's declared abandoned, it's turned over to the state, and then it becomes part of our unclaimed funds unit. We try to match people back up with that money and return it to them. What's in the governor's proposal is to shorten the dormancy period so that some of those financial accounts would, on a faster track, be declared dormant, turned over to the state as abandoned property. Obviously, we need to keep money in our accounts so that when people put in to get it back, we have enough money there. But the reality is this abandoned property goes back decades, to the 1940s, some of which will never be claimed. So that money just doesn't sit there, and we can use it for for state purposes. So this would speed up that process of declaring certain accounts dormant and abandoned. It should be helpful in terms of the state budget situation, but it also underscores for New Yorkers, keep track of your accounts, and especially if you're moving, changing your address, make sure your financial institution knows where you are so your property doesn't become declared abandoned.
Actually, I had some, my family had this situation, so I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's
I had moved, and I had an old, I still have it, a savings account, my first account when I was in high school for my first job. I don't want to close it, even though I don't have much money in it. But I had moved, I hadn't used it. The bank called me, and they said, we're turning this money over to the state. I said, no, I'll go down and I'll deposit $20 to keep the cash. So now I every few months I put some money in, I take some money out. And if you move, the big thing is when you move, let anybody you're doing business with know what your new address is.
So it gives the state some more money to play with, essentially. I mean, how much money are we talking about, though? Do you know?
Potentially. I mean, their estimate is an increase of about $100 million.
Well, that's a lot of money. So,
it is.
So there's also another provision in here that the governor, it changes the way, part of what was UB 2020 and now is SUNY Empowerment, it changes procurement, and there's a piece of that also that impacts your office.
Well, and I have a concern in this area. It would actually take away some of our oversight ability with, with the procurement process with SUNY, and at a time where people are looking for more accountability and more double checking that we're doing things in the right way. I understand the interest in having the process work efficiently for our SUNY system, and we've certainly been working with the Chancellor and trying to make that process work more efficiently. But I don't know that it would be helpful from a taxpayer point of view to lessen the kind of oversight that the Comptroller's Office has. So, we've expressed concern about that particular part of the proposal in the past, and now that it's being presented again, we're going to continue to have concerns about that proposal.
One thing that's not in here, and I think that Mayor Bloomberg has been particularly upset about it, is large-scale pension reform. Are you getting any feeling that there will, in fact, be pension reforms, creation of a sixth tier, perhaps, or something along those lines to sort of reel in the costs?
Keep in mind, as you said earlier, there are these different aspects of the budget still to be determined. There is a labor management savings component, about $450 million. On that list, on the governor's slide, was public employee pension. So, I guess the short answer is there have been no specific proposals as of yet. If that will be part of what labor and management will be discussing, it's possible we'll see something, but we certainly do not have a specific proposal before us right now.
Okay, well, we will obviously be hearing a lot more from you as this process continues, and it's kind of an unusual process the way that there are so many moving pieces that we don't have exact numbers for yet. And so I want to thank you very much, Comptroller DiNapoli, for being here with us, and then we will be seeking more analysis from you in the future.
Great. Look forward to it, Liz. Thank you.
Thanks.